Hello everyone in week's 8 class. Today we will be mapping color spaces. And so what that means is, we'll get into that later. We will start with a kind of short practical exercise, which is continuing on the material from last class. And it will kind of involve us working with some real world data and then doing some sort of analysis, so producing some nice plots with them, which is surprisingly simple to do with like not that much code, but then it might come in handy later as well, I thought. So I wanted to like include this as a small demo at the start of the class. Okay, so the main topic of today's class will be talking about color theories and how we represent colors in PCs, so color spaces and different representations, different ways how to encode images and encode colors, and then later using that in some with some code to sort of show why some of them might be useful for us. So yeah, RGB is not the only kind of encoding. We can have more encodings where the different dimensions mean something interesting for us. So this will be particularly useful for like interactive applications or something where we can sort of move one slider and that will change something which is more intuitive than just like mixing in red into the mix. Okay. So we will start with the data analysis part. So we will do something like this. We will load some data I prepared. We will explore it using some statistics from last class, so average and standard deviation, which are the really basic ones, but still they will be quite useful to see. And then use something like Boxplot. Okay, so and also, by the way, this is the same thing that we have on the Git repo as the starter here. So yeah, if you want to sort of start with an empty one, this is the one. Okay, so this is it. This is the relatively short data analysis demo. We will start with loading some data, and this is basically the data that I isolated from some like experiment that I was doing before with some computer, and I was running some experiment which had different this value, sort of like setting some parameter, and then this was getting up and up because this was sort of the iterations over time, and then I was getting these different values for different runs. So each one of these lines is just like one run of that thing, and this is the second run of that thing, and so this is the X data, and this would be the Y data, or yeah. And so we will just load it like a allocate, connect, and then load, and just show it as a two arrays. Yeah, nothing exciting happening yet. And if we simply print them, they end up like this. Okay, so this is quite difficult to parse. I have no idea what's happening actually. Like this number goes up and these are somehow probably also going up, but to see what's happening, it's really hard. So we can just plot them, and what this thing does is that we'll just include the or import the matplotlib, and then basically go one line by line. So this for one experiment run in data Y means for one line in this two-dimensional array, basically we go for line in this. So 1, 2, 3 for all of them. Always scatter these data, so the X, these coordinates with whatever the line currently is. Yeah. So that's just the simple way how to just go through everything and just scatter them. So which means just draw all the dots on the thing. So you can just rerun it, and then it will be here. So this is as far as the prepared code goes. Now we will somehow want to process it. So this is slightly better than just looking at the raw numbers, because I can see that there are some numbers, like some measurements are going up. However, it's still sort of a mess, right? Like if I were to send someone this data, they would be sort of like, what is this? Like, I can see something is getting up, but how can I actually read it? So in order to do that, we sort of need the statistics that we were talking about last class, which are able to sort of compress this messy information into a more legible plot. And so one thing that we can do is use averages and standard deviations. And so basically for each one of these sort of like columns, you could almost say, for each of these columns, you can always get the average information. And instead of having these as dots, you can sort of connect it as the average line. So this is one of them, and then we will start with this one. And then the second one is just to show you how to use the Boxplot. We will call a library which will basically do the Boxplot visualization for us, which is quite easy. Just like for free, it will just create it from each column. Okay. So let's start with the first one in using the averages and standard deviations. And for that, we will sort of want to compress every one of these columns, we can call them, into like the array of numbers here. So what this means is basically we want to somehow index this structure that we have here, index it in a way that we are getting all of these numbers. So instead of getting the line by line, you want to get a column by column, basically. Okay, and so we were using NumPy, and that one has quite nice indexing, which is using this terminology or this way of indexing. And this is a magic indexer saying, hey, everything for all the lines that you have, always give me the first number. And so this will return for all the lines. So for all of these, it will always return me give me the first number. So basically, by this I'm accessing the first column directly. So these numbers 0.7482 are these 7482 all the way to 808. Cool. So this is you could do this in any way, but this is like a nice concise way how to write it. Okay, and so. Well, how to compress the information? We already talked about having averages and standard deviations, and I think NumPy has it quite nicely. I think it's mean. Yep. So we can just call something like this, and then call this like, this is the mean value, and then we can print it out directly. Okay, that's nice. Instead of 10 numbers, we have 1, which is somehow compressing the whole lot in a sensible way. And then we can have the standard deviation, which will be, I think it's standard deviation of this sort of this column. And then if we print it out, we will get the mean value here. We can also say something like mean equals this, and then standard deviation equals this. Okay, nice. So what these two mean, and we should have some basic understanding from last class, is that most of these numbers revolve around the mean of 0.765 something, and the most of the data that we have is sort of spread in the region of this number plus standard deviation and minus standard deviation. So if I would say it sort of like from a reserved keyword, so I should use something like data is from mean minus standard deviation to data to mean plus standard deviation. And so if I can sort of like print out a new message which will explain this one column, and this will be something like data is around mean in region of data from to data to. Okay, all of this is simple. This is like just basically us saying, okay, cool, we have between these two numbers. Well, right, so this is a text output that is nice, but we sort of don't really want to have text outputs. We want to somehow visualize it in the plot. And so what I'm thinking is that it would be nice to have these three exact values. So basically having the average, the bottom, and the topmost kind of probable area, have them as three lines. So have one line which is sort of getting the averages, have another line which is getting the standard deviations up and down. And this is actually, in fact, something that would be used in like a scientific publication somewhere, or maybe even if you are just sending the data to someone, or if you are showing something what's happening, it's quite like useful to have these three values. Okay, so how to do this? Well, we basically can just copy paste this code a little bit. Wait, I will. Yeah, so I will edit it. So the data x doesn't really change, but these values will change. This is let's say that in color blue we want to have the averages, and then in let's start with that. Well, so what is averages? Well, it's empty for now. We didn't create it yet. Well, we would like to have a list here that will be full of these mean values. So that's easy. We can go something like for e in range. We can just go for all these columns, and that will be the size of, we can use as an inspiration sort of like how many data samples we have in X. Well, does this make sense? This would give us how many lines we have. Is that correct? No, we want the columns. So we want something like of the first column of the first line, how many data samples it has. I mean, this is 10 for both, so it wouldn't really matter now, but if you have some other data, I still want it to work. Okay, cool. And so we can basically move all of this code. Instead of calling it the first column, we can just call it a column. And instead of this being the first one, we can just always sample the ith one. So if I just run it here, there will be error with the plot because I don't have any data. But okay, this is going one by one. I should have said continue here, and then always calculating the mean and getting these three values, which is nice, but it's also too verbose. I don't really need to print any of them. So we can add these values that we got, so append them and append the mean value, and then we will end up with having a plot which already has the averages in there. Okay, so this is a line which is basically describing how these numbers go. I can also include both of it, so I can this can be our debug, sort of just to check the data. And basically this was the data. Can I make it gray maybe, so it's not so visible? Okay, this was the data, and then we have this line which is kind of comparing the averages. Okay, so this is maybe too much, but if we hide it, then we can see the basic plot. And also maybe we by some chance know that the values should go from 0 to 1, so we can say ilim, which is going to tell it I want to limit everything, or I want to change this axis to go from 0 to 1. Okay, and this kills it. Okay, this shouldn't kill it. It's just the fast thing, but okay. So now we have sort of plotted it between 0 to 1. Okay, this is nice. Maybe this is too much. Maybe we don't see the details, so let me just change it. Okay, this is nicer, cleaner plot. Okay. I would like to also add these sort of data froms, and that have that as one possible value, and then have something like data twos. I mean, like you can name this more sensibly, of course, and we can always add or append these values to it. So this would be here. This would be here. And then we have sort of saved these three values. I mean, if I cut it here and just print out them, these three, just to sort of to have a debug information, I can look at these three. And so yeah, it seems like all of them have 10 numbers in them, which is not visible, but I know it. They have 10 numbers in them, and then they are in the right shape to be plotted. So we can also plot them, and let's say that they would be orange. And we don't want the averages there, but we want to show the froms and the twos. Yeah. So just as sort of like to bring us back, the average is the average value. The from is the average value minus whatever the standard deviation was for that value or for that column, and this the data 2. So this one contains the mean value plus the standard deviation then. Okay. And if we plot it, we will have this sort of plot which is telling us, hey, you have the data mostly revolving around this line, and it sort of lies within these two boundaries, which is, I think you can somehow tell it style dashed or something. You can just spend a lot of time on styling the plot, which we will not be doing. But this is a sort of one way how to compress the data that you are showing. And you can also imagine I'm just loading 10 samples here, right? So even if I just show it with everything, this is still sort of like, it's still manageable to see it. But imagine that there were thousands and thousands of data samples here, and so I really don't want to show them. I really just want to show the average and the standard deviation boundaries. Okay, right, so let's step into the second sort of subtask of this, and I will hide this. And that is using a Boxplot. Well, just how to create Boxplot, it's as simple as this. So you have some, I just wrote some numbers here, you have some numbers here, and then you just call Boxplot on it, and it will just pop out this thing. And it's relatively easy. And so if I want to just plug it with the data that I have here, I would, again, isolate the first column and then print it. And I want to sort of have a Boxplot from these values. Let's call it like this. Then I would say, basically I can just copy this thing, right? And instead of showing the data, I would show the column instead. So let's see. Yeah, I can also say something like plot.ilim, so it's on the same scale. And then I'm showing the sort of first line or the first column information rather than as it was here as these two values. Right? I'm showing it as this plot. So this is, I guess it's not really useful that much in this case, but this is maybe more useful when you would have just a few data or yeah, not that many time steps, but you would have just one data source that you want to really explain like what's happening in that one column. So if I does this work? Let's see. Nope. Okay, there was a way how to like have two of them, and I forgot how this is done. Does this work? Yes. Okay, so probably if I call this column 1 and then have another one which will be maybe the last one. I'm not sure now. Maybe this will fail, but yay, it worked. So in the first one, I'm showing how the behavior was in the first slide, and in the second one, I'm showing it how it was in the 9th one, or I can also show the second one. So I can directly compare what is the behavior between these two plots. So I can see that the average has changed, which is cool, but and the standard deviation as well. But there is an outliner which wasn't really visible in this case, and yeah, I don't know. So again, this is a demo, so it doesn't make that much sense in the data I'm showing. Let's see. Yeah, okay, I'm looking for some outliners, and so outliers. So in a like real world scenario where you would have maybe 1,000 points in there, and you would be showing the statistics, it would make more sense. But this is just like a short demo intro. Okay, cool. So yeah, does this make sense? I will upload the solution of this basically later. Well, so this was just a short sort of like the starter, also to mix it up with a practical session at the start rather than directly going into lecture. And now, actually, we will have a pause. So after the pause, I will go into the color theory, so something about these circles and these things, just to explain a bit about that, about primary colors and mixing, and what that means later to us as a inside computer sciences and then when programming. But for now, we will have a pause. Welcome back from the pause. Let's talk about the topic of today's class, which is the working with color spaces. And yeah, so this question all started in ages ago, hundreds of years ago, where people were figuring out sort of color theories. And the question that they wanted to answer is that if you mix some colors, some primary basic colors, if you can target all possible variations with those colors. So there are some, I don't know, like mixing white and black, and then with some other colors you would be getting some other combinations. This is pretty old. This whole even scientific field is pretty old, and so how to bring all of this into sort of like current nowadays used methods when you are working with computers and maybe representing some colors there. We had to sort of go through a step which sort of standardized all of that. So this was sort of the predecessor or the starting work on this field. Predecessor, that's the word. Jesus. And somewhere in the 19th century, a more scientific way how to describe this color was discovered by Maxwell. So he tried to answer the question of mixing, if we can mix three colors into any other color, and he was doing it with this experiment. So the experiment is to sort of have some target colors and always try to match them with whatever you are like, with some three primaries. So there is a lot of text here, but I will just sort of briefly jump through it. The viewer or the participant in this experiment was asked to sort of turn small knobs to adjust how strong each of those primary lights works. And then at some moment, there was some other color mixed into this, and then all of this was used to get some numbers from it. So basically he mathed it. And so which sort of math he used, we don't really have to go into too much of the details. However, we can sort of go into into this theory. So first, the brightnesses of the three primaries were adjusted and to match some white color. And so this sort of measured how sort of the relative proportions in a white mixture. And then one of the three primary lights was replaced by a test color, and such as orange light. And that one was used to, by subtracting and renormalizing the contribution of the two primaries in the second white mixture, blah blah blah. They were able to get the absolute values. So some like relative proportion was established here, and by testing it with another color, they got the absolute values. So this is not really that important, the details of this experiment. Basically, they were measuring how large proportions of each of these colors are needed to match a color. Okay, so this was the first version. They sort of restarted the experiment later with having different colors and then matching with whole RGB. So with the 3 primaries that we sort of roughly know these days. And this sort of gave them the intensities of each of these colors needed to get any number or any color from this range. However, there were some problems in this. So it all worked nice, right? So you get the greens, the reds, the blues, and if you are inside this triangle, this means you are sort of mixing these colors with each other, right? So somewhere here you would mix most of blue and then like 1/9 of red, or you can just sort of jump in this sort of field and you're mixing maybe like 0.3 of green, which is basically like roughly this corresponds to the distances from the sides, and this is a way how you can mix everything inside. And so in math, this would be some sort of like linear combination of these 3 basic units with these coefficients will create any color you want inside this area, which is nice. The slight problem came where they were trying to they discovered that there are some pigments which are way more saturated than any of the things that came up from this diagram. So that they discovered basically that there are colors outside of the 3 colors that they were using to mix. And so this is a bit of a problem. The way how they tried to solve it was by sort of reducing one of those or subtracting one of those colors in order to move them from here somewhere inside that region. And so in that case, you would be able to map them inside, but you had to sort of mix in a color not only to this part, but also to this part. And so we will see that more in detail later as well. Okay, so what we get is more or less a gamut, and that is maybe it's a new term, so let's sort of define it. A gamut is an area made from 3 points, where these 3 points represent the colors we have, and everything inside it is basically the colors we can mix from it. So this diagram here is basically the same as this diagram here, only sort of reprojected a little bit differently. Okay, so that's good. And the problem lies in the colors that are sort of outside of this of the 3 primaries that we chose initially, right? Because just a side note, in theory, we could have chosen any other 3 primaries. We could have chosen yellow, green, and like pinkish here, and then we would be combining the colors inside this triangle instead. But they chose these 3 from some previous theories, sort of. But still, even with this, which is relatively large sort of gamut, so the representable colors are quite a lot actually. You still get colors which are out of the gamut, out of that area. And these are real colors which you cannot really mix from these. So that's a problem. So on this plot, we kind of, or this graph, we can see the RGB and so this would be the RGB gamut, and then all the colors inside it are the sort of real colors that we can mix. The out of gamut colors, so things that are falling outside here, are something where we had to sort of maybe mix in colors to the matched color in order to get those. And so people were kind of you still want to somehow measure those values here, even though you don't have those primaries. Or you could have the primary getting numbers somewhere here if you chose, instead of this green, some color here, so maybe a different green. But you would have another triangle here, and then you still would be sort of losing this one then. So it's sort of like, it's an arbitrary choice, but it will always make your life hard because you cannot really mask everything. Okay, and so they come up with a mathematical model, which was a using these three primaries. Why not? It's all in like the same space, right? So these X, Y, Z, you can imagine them as three sort of colors. So we were mixing red, blue, and red, green, and blue here. So in here we are mixing the color X, the color Y, and the color Z, and then getting some numbers. Except that the colors here, these three Gumboot sort of points of the triangle, are imaginary. So they don't really exist as colors. They exist as a theoretical color that you would have if you had the ultra red or something, basically, here. And yeah, so this is a mathematical way how to sort of go around this problem. Okay, so let's see it again a little bit. So this is the RGB standard, so mixing three colors with RGB, and the problem is if you plot these lines. So let's imagine it here that we want to match this color, right? I don't know what this one is, but let's say that we want to kind of create this. Let's say that this is orange or something. Maybe not, but anyway. So let's try to match this one. Well, so these plots will tell us that I want this amount of this color of blue, this amount of green color, so like somewhere above 0 from green, and then a lot of red. So this will be kind of reddish color in total. Okay, well, if you look at the plot, you probably will notice that there are some problems, namely here, where we are suddenly mixing in negative values of red. And so this basically shows these colors here show us these out of this gamut colors. Okay, well, that's a problem, and when working with plots, we cannot really work with negative intensities as well. Yeah, this is a visualization how basically why we even have some negative value here. And I was saying that we are in the experiment, we are sort of matching two colors, and we are adding some blue, some green, some red, which are sort of the defined primaries that we chose, or the primary lights. And we are matching like whatever we are getting here, the desired value, with these three. And so the reason why we are getting the negative values here is that let me play this. At some moment, right, somewhere here, in order to mix this like ultra green or something with these colors, you actually had to change even the reference light. So it's not possible to get this green. I mean, this is all converted to RGB because it's on our screens. So you are you are seeing them actually, but you can imagine that there is a color which would be a green, which is sort of undisplayable using these three primaries. And the only way how you can achieve that one, mixing it from these three, is actually cheating and mixing it from this value instead. So basically, you're subtracting some red from the relative light or from the relative color that you are mixing here. So this explains why we are sometimes in the negative here. Okay, so yeah, some numbers, some colors are really okay because we are just mixing these three, but yeah, you can see that even you had to subtract some blue here as well, and then definitely subtract a lot of red here. Okay, so this is sort of explaining why it is possible to have that negative plot. Okay, well, so we live in a maths world, which is an ideal world where everything can work if we rephrase the program well. And so what they did is that they rephrased the problem from having it in RGB coordinates, sort of reproject every color in the world, every possible combination, into this into this space. So into the combination of three non-existing but still imaginary colors. Okay, and so if we do that, we have reprojected all the values from here, from this RGB system, into the location of them in this XYZ system, and then everything we get is actually nice, positive, we don't have any values which would require negative luminosity or negative intensity of the light. So yeah, problem solved. We mathed it, and then it all works. But these imaginary colors, the ones that you are mixing it with, they don't exist. Okay, well, so practically, how do we solve this conundrum? Because we cannot mix with XYZ, with non-existing colors. And yet somehow we live in a world where we know that this is an RGB value, that there is a lot of blue. We live in a world where there are displays that can produce RGB, right? So people solved it somehow, right? Must have. So the way how they did it is that we are not actually mixing on these displays. We are not mixing from the original RGB presets, primary colors set on the 1931 experiment. We are instead using like a different set of 3 colors, different red, different green, different blue, and it was the one which was mixed at Microsoft in 1996, and they called it the sRGB. So this is suddenly getting into a realm where we maybe are recognizing this. So this shortcut is something that you can probably see on like compression of your photos or like images in PC. Or in Photoshop where you are editing something, or maybe actually even like in a camera where you are setting the color profile, the setting of how you will save the image as, and sometimes you have to choose from sRGB as the gamut of your choice, or the other ones. And so there are many other possibilities. For example, there is one by Adobe called Adobe RGB, and they are using their own 3 primaries to represent everything. Okay, well, this seems nice, but the problem is that basically, let's imagine that these are all the possible colors that we as humans can see. We are not even talking about like the colors that some animals can see or something, because that range can be even larger. But let's just limit it to the simple case of humans. So this gamut is all the possible colors that we can see, but neither with any one of these systems, these gamuts, we cannot actually mix them. So there are colors that you cannot really see if you display them in a PC using the sRGB. The Adobe RGB is slightly better in terms of greens, for example, but then yeah, again, it's missing out on here. I think there are some other systems and some other versions which are sometimes trying to cover larger areas, but still all of them have the problem that none of these can sort of express all the colors that we as humans can perceive. Well, so that's a problem. Okay, maybe also one thing to add is that this plot here is showing quite nicely what the XYZ system is useful for, because even though the colors there are imaginary, so we cannot really represent them, we can use that system to sort of compare different other gamuts inside it. So let's say that these are all the possible colors for the XYZ, and in those coordinates we can sort of talk about the coordinates of different systems, and so we can compare the other systems through the XYZ. And sometimes what happens is also that if we want to sort of convert from this one, this system into this system, which can happen, or maybe we are even converting it into some other completely different system, well, then we would have to go from sRGB into XYZ, and then from XYZ into Adobe RGB. Yeah. So there is a lot of pain that we don't have to that we don't want to care about, really. Okay. Well, so furthermore, there are some more problems, right? So none of these gamuts can match whole human perception. That's the first one. First point. Second point, none of the systems we usually use to scan the information from the surrounding, so something like a camera, is exact. So whenever we are taking a picture, we are losing information. We are sort of degrading the colors from the beautiful real world into something that our digital chip can store, or even like an analog film can store. None of these is perfect. So this is loss of information, number one. None of the systems we, like a third point, none of the systems we use to show these informations, so any displays, none of them is actually exact. Or they are not even standardized with each other, right? So even like one screen to another screen can be a problem. Working with one screen and then trying to work on a slide, let's say, and then trying to move those slides to some presentation somewhere where it's being projected from a display, from a projector. Again, the setting will be different. So the sort of perceived information is lost again. Well, and so that these 3 points are not sort of the only thing. Fourth point, well, every human's perception is actually different. So even the 1931, the CCI, which was this plot that they get here, these values, they got those values by averaging some like 20 people in an experiment. So I don't know if it was 20, maybe they had some additional experiments where it was larger samples, but it is still basically, it's a problem because it's just an average perception. Okay, and with all of these, we are still living in this world and we are just fine with it, which is okay, because basically, at the end, who really cares? There is some loss of information and we have sort of grown used to this and it's okay. You're trying to save something in the raw, which is maybe kind of trying to circumvent these places, but still then you have to sort of print out the final thing in one color system or something, and so you are losing the information there, but it's okay. Like, we can live with that, basically. Okay. So here is my favorite comic. Here is a evolution of his understanding of color over time. So color is on the scale of from grade school understanding to now. 3 primary colors mixed together, or a rainbow and each color is a wavelength. Unknowable, maybe what I see as blue you see as something. 3-ish primary colors mixed together, so RGB, RYB, SMIC, etc. A mix of infinite wavelengths filtered through 3 eye pigments. Right. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. There are sort of like roughly 3 types of cells in human eyes which are detecting color. So that was the original inspiration for us to have 3-ish primary colors. Something about the opponent color system: an abstract multidimensional gamut. CCI 1931, lab, etc. An abstract multidimensional gamut filtered through inconsistently implemented device color profiles. Well, this point is basically what I was showing last slide. This thing, I cannot even read it, and then hopefully someone else's problem. Well, so if you want more details, there are some slides to like at the a sort of color survey and how people perceive colors, etc. So more details here. Well, so I will sort of end up at this moment telling you that it's okay. We have worked until now with all of those imperfections, and it's sort of okay for us. We will just accept that they are not perfect. Until now, all of this was mostly theoretical, and we do want to sort of ask the question from sort of programming standpoint. If we have colors in 3 channels, so RGB, what are there some possible better representations of these 3 colors or of these colors with sort of channels which would be maybe more intuitive for us than mixing red, blue, and green? I mean, it's okay. We sort of know from a real world how mixing these 3 colors, how it will behave. But at some moments, we sort of would like to maybe have some more control over that. Well, so one thing that we might want to do is that changing the color on one of these channels by like one jump. We would like that the relative effect of jumping in different channel with the same jump would affect the perceived change as the same, plus minus, right? Because everything is relative with colors, kind of. So we would like the changes in one direction to be sort of very intuitively understandable as a change in another direction as well. Well, some types of models work with this. What we would like to also do is that is to map some of these channels instead of RGB into some easy to understand responses. So yeah, let me illustrate it with these examples. People wanting to do this is exactly the reason why there are standards such as HSV, LAB, LUV, etc. There are many like this. And so what this means is, for example, on the let's illustrate it on a LAB system, which is a color system mapped from X, Y, Z. So the problem here is that these colors, this is mixing from the imaginary colors, which is harder to work with, definitely. But this color system, or this color space, is more perceptually linear than other color spaces. So this means exactly the first point that we are saying, that if we change in one direction, we sort of would like it to change in the change to be the same as if we change it in another. Sort of the intensity of change to be perceptually the same, right? So moving on this yeah. So LAB has three coordinates again. One is L, the lightness, and then there are A and B, and the A and B is sort of influencing the color range. So you can sort of stay with lightness here, and then you're like changing A and B to move on this plot. Okay. Well, maybe you sort of know this visualization of the colors from some image editing softwares, because like having a crosscut like this will basically give us the access to all possible colors there. Okay. Well, one nice thing about LAB is that it's device independent. Well, there is some sort of like definition of white point that we have to do for the LAB. So there are some different types of LAB still, because people just create new standards every day, which is terrible. But it is more or less device independent. While if you are sort of saying RGB and saying the sRGB, I think people interpret it differently on different devices. Okay, and so this system, because it's device independent, is usually used as a conversion system, because when you are converting from RGB to SMIC, for example, you have to go through some intermediate step where you go through the XYZ system. So you convert from RGB to XYZ, probably from XYZ to LAB, then save it there, and then when you are loading it, you load it from LAB to XYZ, and then from XYZ to SMIC. Well, all of this happens somewhere in the background, so you don't have to care about it, but this is probably how they are doing it, to like have as minimal losses in each of these conversions as possible. Okay, well, LAB is one of those systems. There are other ones. There is one called HSV, and this one is trying to be more kind of have reasonable dimensions. So have these letters mean something. So it's a sRGB system remapped as hue, saturation, and value, and the value is basically brightness. And so when you have this system, you have this sort of circular, well, you are sort of moving around this thing. You are changing the value, would be changing the brightness. At any moment, you can sort of get more saturated or desaturated color by changing the S coordinate. And the hues are mapped around this circle. So changing the hue will be sort of like getting the different color, getting a rainbow, sort of. But you are then able to say, oh yeah, but I would like this color but slightly darker, or this color but slightly more saturated. So it's a more convenient way how to sort of interact with colors. Okay, well, so you would see something like this in a maybe some interactive installation somewhere where we want to control these three colors or these three coordinates, and we maybe are moving something to sort of influence that. And we want this response to be sort of intuitive. So, yeah. Okay, so you might recognize something like this. This is a screenshot from Photoshop, where you are picking a color here, but you also at the same time have these HSB, which is the HSV, You can call it brightness sometimes as well. So it's the same system, or as expressed in RGB, or as expressed in LAP, or as expressed in SMIC. So there are some conversions here. You're probably losing something if you were to change the colors on the fly. But some of these color pickers are also kind of like sampling the colors from some nicer regions of colors. So imagine that you had this as a color picking system. You are sampling these colors on this circle, and that will sort of allow you to faster find the color that you need, sort of. Right? I don't know which one they are using here. I think this will be brightness, but there is something mapped here as well, and here. Yeah, I don't know which one they are using here. But yeah. Okay. Well, so because this is a relatively practical class, we do want to ask the question how to do all of this in Python. And the good message is that at none of the points in programming we will have to actually use those conversion systems here. So we will not have to manually convert from one to another and then back and then to the third one. Because there are so many libraries existing, we can probably use some of them, and then this will do it for us in a standardized manner. So there are libraries called ColourSys. I think this one is the native library, and then skimage, which is the one which we might have to install. And they allow us to convert between HSV and RGB. So in this direction or the other one, and also the same for like lab and other colors as well. Yeah. So RGB to lab, because lab is working in XYZ. I think what happens here is probably they converted from RGB to XYZ, and then from XYZ to lab, and then you can work with that in the lab domain. But yeah. Okay. So yeah, what we will want to do is then on the at the end of this class, we will sort of work with a practical example when we will be mapping into these domains. So we will sort of try to map into these three values and see how it sort of, maybe how it is different than mapping into RGB. Okay, and in order to do that, we will have a very short recap of some trigonometry and periodic functions, because in the task that we will be doing, we will be mapping some sort of numbers, so maybe from 0 to 1 into one of these channels, and see what change occurs there. And so periodic functions can be sort of a helpful way how to just get some nice sequence of numbers that we can then map. Okay. Well, the short recap will be very short. We can look at so we will usually be using some combination of sinuses and cosinuses, and we can use something like this to look at them interactively. And so this is just a plot with like some samples. If I were to add sinus of x, you can just look at whatever sinus of x, and then you can just add cosinus as well, which we all sort of know. Or you can try to, like, I found these as some combinations of existing sinus functions or existing other periodic functions, or maybe something as complicated as this, where you're sort of getting like, I guess, teeth or something, and this, where you're getting sort of this sort of behavior. Well, so this is just like a helpful function which will then generate us some numbers that we will use to map into the different color spaces. Okay. Right. Oh yeah, there is a bonus which is using these periodic and trigonometric functions, sinus and cosinus. We can also generate something called the Lissajous curves. And mathematically, this is just a system where we are always getting two parameters, so x and y, and that would be the location on the plot here. And we are somehow just evaluating from 1 to basically 3 parameters, and with t changing from 0 to 1, or actually from 0 to infinity, we are then changing a kind of sampling points on this curve. And well, depending on the setting of these parameters, especially a and b, especially the ratio of the A and B, we can get figures which look like ellipses, or something which looks like circles, or just a line where it's just on one side, or something like parabols, or something like more complex curves, like some complicated things like this. So just to show this a little bit, and I will, yeah, so they have some mechanism to just produce these in the real world, and I think around 5th minute there was a nice example of, so they have sort of some system which is producing these values of A and B and these delta, etc. So they are creating these sort of on the fly in the system, and so when turning those knobs, they can sort of see what different curves those will be creating. Okay, and so these are just changing the parameter A and B to, like, I don't know, scale one and reduce the other one, or the other way around. Okay. So one kind of cool thing to add into this is that, well, math appears at surprising moments again and again when studying nature sciences. There is a Jan Salabek, like a Czech scientist, biologist from sometime last century, who was trying to study the movements of plants, and so he had sort of a setup like this, where there was a camera going at a very slow frame speed, so it was getting frames maybe every hour, and then you would get a sort of animation of how the plant is moving around when it's growing up. And so this turns out to be following some sort of curves which almost look like Lissajous curves. And so this is maybe just like a bonus note, actually. It's not that important for today's class as well, but it's sort of maybe an example where some math model that we have sort of established before seems to actually correspond to something happening in the nature as well. And so at some moment we could probably get some understanding of what's happening inside the plant, and sort of like why is it growing in this way. This could also be explained by these models. Well, yeah, so this is just a bonus. And let's look at the sort of the other demos of Lissajous curves. This thing, and this is, oh shit, here. So these are all the possible sort of types of results we can have. And this is the time going from 0 to 2p, and then it's repeating itself. And so these are sort of ways, different plots that we can produce. And so we always have this one point is always on the location of x and y, which is let's leave it, which is the location derived from these formulas. Okay. So we are sort of at the end of today's theoretical explanation, and what will follow up after the pause will be our programming task. So we will sort of try to work a little bit with what we were talking about today with the color spaces, and the task will be to map some periodic function, or let's start maybe just mapping numbers from 0 to 1, but then later maybe mapping a periodic function from that number into one of the dimensions of the non-RGB color systems. So hopefully at the end of this you will be able to get what they sort of meant with definitions of RGB being mixed with 3 primaries versus something like HSV, where we are mixing not primaries but mixing the behavior that we want to see. So changing the hue, or changing the saturation, or changing the brightness. Okay. So up until now, is everyone okay with all of this? So let's continue with the programming task. The task there will be relatively simple. It will be mostly just running the code that I prepared and then looking at what this does. Quite generally, the topic will be to map into some of these non-RGB color systems, and so you can start with this. Okay. Well, so there will be a bit more code today, sort of code that I will probably not explain every line of this, but just the general idea. And what we want to end up is to map some values into this color space. For example, the HSV color space. But we will start with the RGB, and sort of the first step will be to just create an image which will have some boxes inside it. So let's say some X by Y number of boxes, and each of these boxes will be some pixels sized, some pixels wide, and then let's sort of color these this grid and each of these boxes with a different color. And so a lot of this code is already there. Basically, if I would jump to the results here, it is building up on the code that we started with last class. Oh yeah, it has to connect. So we just instantiate some like zeros here, which is white color, I think, and then we are black, okay, and then we are creating a block from it. So, oh yeah, the image from it basically. So if I were to say that maybe empty image from like I don't know 100 to 300, and then from the same on the other coordinate is not oh yeah, and then in all RGB values is not just the 0, but it's ones. I would get, oh yeah, I would get something wrong. Oh yeah, okay, I see. Because yeah, we want to sample numbers not just from 0 to 1, but from 0 to 255, because this conversion here works with them as a full RGB value. So if we are to run it, we would get a white color here. Nice. Right, so what this code here does is that it creates a sort of goes in one direction of the X and then in the other direction of the Y, so sort of jumps in some blocks here and then in some blocks here. So it's like for loop going wide and on the height as well. And then we are getting the coordinates here of a sort of the same way as we were mapping from 100 to 300 and then 100 to 300 here. We will be mapping from this value until this value, and so pixel per sample is 50, so it will be like from 0 to 50 and then from again 0 to 50, and so this will be our first block. And so these are just the indices, sort of the values that we will use. And then if you can see here, the empty image from the first number to the second number, and then from the third number into the fourth number. So this thing is the same as what we had here, basically, right? So, and then there is some magic happening here, which I will just hide. And we are assigning it with something, and that something is, for now, let's copy this one out. Let's assign it with blacks. So everything is right now black, or if we assign it with 255 again, everything will be white. So there is a grid of colors, but we don't really see it here. Okay. So what we actually want is not to just assign some number here, but we want to somehow kind of like assign this coordinate, which is going from 0 to the length of the samples with this number. So if I would say to something like this, it will give me some rows. And if I would say something like this, it will give me some columns. And yeah, I mean, this is still relatively simple. What I want to do with this is to map it somehow more in a better way, right? So what does this mean? We know that I is going from 0 to samples X. We want that J is going from 0 to samples Y, and we want to normalize these sort of into a value which would be from 0 to 1. So not by not 0 to samples x, but from 0 to 1. So we do this here by like getting the y. We are normalizing it in between 0 and 1 here by getting that number and dividing it by the number of samples. Well, I looked at whatever the values were, and I had to undo one, so to map in between 0 and 1 exactly. So if I just mask these first, these numbers, I can print it here. Right now, nothing will happen because I will always just, with the image, I will always be assigning it with zeros, so it still doesn't change. But I am looking at these values, and they are going from 0 all the way to 1. And then if I looked at the j values, and I will have to do this after I create it, then these y and j values will basically go 0 to 1 in the first dimension, and then the second one will be going from 0 to 1 within all of these, right? So this is just basically for loop. If I could write inside the for loop here for e in like to say for e in hop go from 0 all the way to 1, it would be nice, and I wouldn't have to do this normalization. But sample doesn't allow us to, range doesn't allow us to give it some real number. We will have to give it a integer number. So this is how we are getting from these real integer numbers that are flowing in from the y, how we are converting them into a number between 0 and 1. Okay. So why would we do all of that? Well, so now at this moment we are getting a normalized value. So like one coordinate basically is a value between 0 and 1, and we can actually map it into the R, the red value. So in this example, we will be mapping the number which goes from 0 to 1 into red channel. And so we basically we can imagine that this is a number going from 0 to 1, which is multiplied by 255, which means that the red value will go from 0 to 255. And then we will assign it back to the image, and let's see what that will create. And this is creating a gradient, and it's creating a gradient from all zeros into us changing just one coordinate of that system, right, of the RGB. So we are increasing the number in the in one of those three primaries, basically. So in here there is a combination of no primaries, which is black, and then we are sort of mixing in one of them, which will be the red one. Okay. Well, you probably have noticed that inside this code, I'm also doing the same for the J, and also this is the reason why I'm not just showing it as a single line, but I'm also showing it as a grid. And this allows us to do something with the J coordinate. And let's see another example of mapping J, which again goes from 0 to 1, when we normalize it, to map into the green coordinate. Okay, and so maybe we know what will happen, sort of, we can expect it. You can see that this R value here will come here into this color block basically, and the green value will come here as well into this color block, and the green will stay. The blue will stay 0, and then we assign it into this block that we chose, and then everything inside that block. All the RGB values will be replaced by these RGB values. So let's see what will happen with the R and G both changing. Well, and what we can see is that in the top leftmost corner, we have 0 of all the primaries. If we go on this axis here, we are mixing in the red primary color, and if we go in this direction, we are mixing in the green primary color. And so somewhere in here in the middle are the more interesting colors, which are sort of mixed between red and green. And if we fully combine them, we get something like yellow. Okay, well, this is not really surprising for us, I guess. I think I just wanted to show the demo that this is something that we can sort of play around with. So instead, if we were not to mix into reds, but into blues, we can sort of have a thing like this. Or we can at the start say that because blues are coordinated by this, greens are coordinated by this, we can also say that we already want to start with red on one, then everything should be sort of mixed with red. Well, is it working? I guess it is working. I guess there is... oh right, yeah, not 1 by 255. That's the one. Yeah, inside all of this, we have to kind of take care for the normalization and for the ranges, because these have some nice colors, right? There is 1 or 255 for every color in this corner, whereas there is just the red. Okay. So does this make sense? Do people get this code? Yep, awesome. Yeah, it is just a demo, honestly. Like, maybe it's not as easy to read because there is just a lot of it, because I commented a lot of it as well, but it's just a demo to sort of show us playing around with this, with these functions that we were, or like with the color system that we are talking about. Okay, so also what this allows us, that we don't have to sample by 50 by 50, but we can just have a much more smoother gradient, and it will take some more time, a little bit, but we will get like a nice gradient, so something like this. And I guess this could be a color picker that we can use later in some application that we are creating. Okay, so well, this is good enough for something. As a color picker, it would actually work as well. Like, you can be getting the color at some value or something. If you had interactive interface, which we don't have on the Google Colab, and you would have to code it somehow. But you can already sort of like start playing around with that. The one problem is that you may say that the RGB is not as intuitive. Well, let's have it really smooth, but still. Well, to end up with like a nice one being plotted there. Okay, so this is a nice pair. Each pixel is different smooth image which you generated, which is nice. But this plot is not really that intuitive. Well, I have some basic understanding of like getting like, okay, if I'm mixing in a lot of greens, it will be green. If I'm mixing in blues, it will be blue. If I'm mixing it somewhere in the between, it's probably going to be some teal color or something, right? But I still have to kind of like think about it a little bit. If I want to say, oh yeah, I would like to move these into reds more, what do I do? Well, I will mix in the red. But if I want to move it into yellows more, what do I do? I start getting lost quite soon. So the case is that RGB is not intuitive enough, and we, for example, can use something like the HSV, so the hue saturation value or brightness, as another system that we would be mapping into. So, okay, so before I open up the code down there, basically we will copy paste this whole thing, and instead of mapping into RGB here, we will be mapping into HSV, changing the HSV here, and then finally somewhere here kind of converting the whatever the HSV value we had into RGB. Well, the last bit is necessary because we cannot really write in HSV directly into this, and also in all of those cases we are still working with an RGB display, so we do want to plot it in the end, to plot it back into RGB. But around here we are still interacting with it, and so this part is we can sort of work with it in any reprojection we want. So HSV might be quite nice. So yeah, let's open it. Okay, so in order to do that, what I was just saying, we will somehow need to have a HSV to RGB converter. Well, and this is basically the shortest example of this. Using the color sys, which should be a native library, I can go, I can give it the HSV values like this directly, and then convert it into the RGB value. What this does is that, let's print them here. it will output them as a 0 to 1, so normalized color, which is nice, but we still do want to kind of convert it, because in this case, when we are plotting it here, this color needs to be between 0 and 255. So there can be some confusion. You basically do have to convert it back into the full spectrum. Nice. So this is the short demo, and then we will basically copy this thing and then plug it into the piece of code that we had above. So here we are again working with the same, or like a new empty image, but with the same principle, having block by block, sampling block by block, and then changing that block into one particular color. We can again change how many samples there will be, and then how large these samples are, so some simple stuff. Okay, so we have, let's hide it, we have I going from 0 to the number of samples, so 10, and then j also from 0 to the number of samples, again 10. We still need to sort of normalize these, so going from 0 to 9, I think we have to divide it by basically 9, so that's what happens here. And we somehow get the normalized I value and the normalized B value. Okay, and then here is the difference, and that one is that we have 3 coordinates called H, S, V. We start them with 1. I think it will be either black, it might be red as well. I think there might be red. I'm not sure if this is correct, but yeah, it's fine. So we get these values. For now, we just keep them the same way. We keep them at 1. We don't do anything with them because this is just a demo, and then we will project them into RGB space and then assign this. I mean, this color is just three numbers, right? So it's the same thing that we had here, these 3 colors basically. And we will assign these 3 colors back into that block. So let's see this. I think this will be, oh yeah, red. Okay. So we start with red. We start with an image which has hue on the value of 1, which is something that someone had to sort of figure out. But the saturation is at 1, which means that it's as saturated as possible. And the value, which means the brightness, is also at 1, which means it's as bright as possible. So we can kind of already try hacking into that directly. Let's say that we want half the saturation, and we will get slightly less saturated red everywhere, which is good. Well, it is something that we sort of can expect, right? We know what will happen. If we say, so if we go back into the red, if we change the value, which would be the brightness, and then again have it half of that, we will get much darker red, sort of. So this dimension for saturation and value, these are sort of moving in, if you were to scroll all the way up here, inside this sort of space. So the hue one is the one which will be the interesting one, right? Because we have the one which goes through all the nice colors. But these two are sort of predictable in the way that, okay, mixing in saturation to 0 will turn everything white, and then putting in the value to 0 will make everything black, right? So grays are somewhere on this, like in 0 saturation and value going up and down would be grays, for example, right? So all of this is quite easy to get. Okay, so let's experiment with it in some way. So we have these values, and these already are going from 0 to 1, which is nice because we can directly map the value which is going from 0 to 1 into them. So let's map it into the hues, and that will create a nice, basically, rainbow. And then on the J, so Y is changing the row by row, but on the J we can also sort of map something else. For example, the V, which is the brightness or the value. And so with the leftmost, topmost pixel or block, we are basically seeing a color which is made by value at 0, so the darkest possible, and then with a hue at 1, which means somehow how they encoded red. So if you look at this first diagram, these like where you are on this circle will be changed by changing the value from changing the hue from between 0 to 1, and 1 is somewhere at the red. I don't know where is the 0, but it's sort of circling around it. So yeah, we have seen that basically here, because this is going from 1, or actually no, from 0 to 1. Yeah, so I think, right? Anyway, like it looks like it has sort of red on both ends, actually, because it's a circular diagram. Okay, so instead of V, we could also map it to S, which would be saturation, and so we will get something like this, where these colors are less and less saturated, and the same way as last time, we can also just increase the resolution of the plotted image, and let's say that each pixel, each block is actually sized of just 1 pixel, and let's see how nicely smooth it is actually. And so, I mean, I don't know if this is nicer as a tool to select colors, but I think it would be simpler to select that color from the HSV rather than from the RGB, because in here, in order to get other colors, you sort of have to start changing these like RGB somehow, and then start messing up with that, and it would be quite difficult. Okay, we can also say that I want, I want all of these, which is like this, but I want the saturation to be just at half point. Oh no, saturation is something we are changing. I want the value then, the brightness, just at the half point. So we are getting like messy colors basically. This is not nice, I guess, not that interesting. Okay. Okay. Well, so this is as far as it goes with us playing around with the basic RGB and HSV colors. Now the next step will be to add the periodic function somewhere there, and the place where we will be adding it is basically trying to mess with this value here, so that it is no longer going from 0 to 1, but it's some adjusted value that we influence. Okay. Well, right. So we passed through all of this. So let's say that we want to test some periodic function as a sort of intermediate between this value which is going between 0 and 1 here, and then between 0 and 1 here. Instead of just mapping the 0 to 1, we somehow want to map like a function of sinusoid here maybe. And so we want to see what the fluctuation of this would look if there was a sinusoid. Maybe it would be rubbish actually, but still we would like to see it. And I guess in this case, it's really important to see or like to figure out between which numbers we are expecting the value to be. So you remember that like the first one was RGB between 0 and 255, and then the HSV was working in between 0 and 1. And we can again look at this visualization of these three plots, and we can see that some of them are actually going from like -3 to 3, and so we would have to maybe divide them by that 3 and maybe then push them up. I mean, basically just normalize them between the 0 and 1. And so here, this is just a visualization. We can already start messing up with it here. I guess, yeah, I can maybe actually show it. So if I had this this function, I can divide it by 3. Divide it by 3. Then it's between 0 and -0, so I will divide it by 6 actually, and then plus 0.5, and then like roughly speaking, all of these values are in between 0 to 1. I mean, I'm not sure if this curve that we are seeing here is anything interesting anymore, because we have flattened it, so maybe it's not. Maybe this would be, or I guess this would be, but this is the way to sort of like normalize it in between ranges that are something that we can sort of work with, right? Okay. And so yeah, this was on using another software or another website to visualize this. Let's actually do this in Python as well. So if we have a function that gets x, and if we call a if we get a sinus from it, let's comment all of it for now, and then just plot it. Oh wait, I will have to import math. And then just plot it, then we will get a basic sinusoid function. And we can see that it's going from -1 to 1. So we can sort of try messing about with it. So we will move it up by 1 and then divide it by 2. And then it should go between 0 and 1. Yeah, which is nice. I mean, for sinus, it's nice and easy. For the other ones, it's maybe simple enough to just check it here, divide it here by something, and then plug it in there as well. And what we can also do is to sort of hack into this frequency value. So maybe change this that the frequency is much higher, so the oscillations are more often, more common. Or the other way around, we can just slow it down entirely. So this is just the start of the sinusoid happening here. Okay, whoops. Okay, so let's leave it at like this crazy sinusoid, super fast one. Yeah, I guess what we will be actually looking at is what it does between 0 and 1. So I can also just say xlim dot plot dot xlim, which means we only care about the numbers between 0 and 1, and then we are sort of zooming in. I mean, like, sorry about this. This is a rough sampling. This looks nicer. Okay, and so if we use this function now, this function called function, because we are creative, well, this function will remap whatever the values we have between 0 and 1 into this sinusoid. Okay, so okay, we have basically copied the same thing from all the way above here into a new strip, a new grid, and basically replaced it so it's not a whole grid, but it's just going between numbers in one strip. So there is just one dimension there. And if I just again kind of just turn it off, we have just one value of red. But then if we start mapping the value that we are getting in y, so the normalized e, and map it through the function, so through this, we will start getting a sort of like pattern here. So I can also just leave it here, and in this case it would go from from 0 to 1. Or I can plug in the function in the middle of it, and so instead of 1 to 0, from 0 to 1, the values that this will go through will be the whatever the sinus says at 0, and up until whatever the sinus says at 1, or not the sinus but this function. So we will be able to actually see this sort of progression there happening as sort of visualized through a plot of colors. I mean, it is just an example of how this works, so it's not super useful that much. Okay, so if we do the same here, so we will keep the saturation from the S, from the Y, I value, so it will be just going from 0 to 1, but then hue will be going not only from 0 to 1, but will be going depending on this function, and just plot it. What we will get is this sort of, well, the same strip that we saw here, this thing, but then kind of across this plot. I think, well, if I edit a function here and edited this as well, you would be starting getting some like nonsense, I think, basically. Yeah, I mean, you can start playing around with this and create some effects or something, but it really doesn't matter that much. And so, yeah, so we like at this moment we can just sort of like start playing around with it. So we can also start mapping this into RGB. So what if we had RGB, but we're mapping it into a sort of using a sinusoid function? Well, you can start generating some tartan designs or something, because you are adding on what is it? This direction, you are adding a green depending on the sinusoid. So 100 of green 0% of green, 100 of green, 0% of green. And the same on this, but for reds. And this is just for fun, sort of, just to show. Yeah. And so I guess actually like mapping the function is a bit more easy to do with RGBs, but to have some like value that users can choose from are something with this one. So I guess with, yeah, I don't know if you would be projecting it with this function in real life, but it's just a demo. We can also show like, so instead of using the sinus, if we comment this out and then use this advanced function, it's called, well, it will be completely boring, so maybe we have to also oh yeah, maybe leave the frequency as it was. Okay, so if we wanted something like this as a function, then this is the one that we saw in this example, no, this one, but normalized between 0 and 1. Well, if we would like to map this one, let's try it and let's see what it does. Well, it's sort of the same patterns, but it will maybe have different distribution of the colors. I mean, this looks a bit strange, right? But yeah, I guess this is just me playing around with this. This is no longer a really educational example, but yeah. Still, this is, I think, everything from the demo then. What it should illustrate is, I guess, the difference between RGB and having a HSV as a color system, and maybe the benefits that we can get from having a color system where we sort of intuitively know what each of the parameters will do. So yeah, that is basically the difference between them two. Okay, so this is basically everything. Let's get back to the slides. Well, so we finished the programming task, and for the next class, I am planning to do something on pathfinding. So until the end of the year, we will have one class with Mick, then this class, and then I will have to have some classes about vectors and matrices and basically linear algebra and all of that jazz. So I will get into that later, I think. But before that, I wanted to have one class on the pathfinding algorithms. Okay. So today, at the start of the class, I was showing some examples from the history of I guess, colorimetry and the sciences of finding colors and defining colors. If you want to read a little bit more about this, there is this page which has quite like very readable, in a very readable form. They are talking about the story of primary colors, and it was quite nice to see. So they are going into more detail as well, but also mentioning other, like, first artists and then other scientists who are sort of exploring the whole area. Well, artists and scientists sometimes together in one person. Okay. Yes. So this is the end of the class. So yeah, hope you liked it.